Okay, here we have an example of how occupying one of the critical squares 2 ranks in front of the pawn is so important and so critical for white in order to win this game. If this pawn, it's white's turn to act right now, if this pawn were already to be on the 4th rank, then and this would be a draw, because white would have to move the king, and if white were to move the king to the H file or the F file, then black will simply oppose white on the very same file, and they can just go back and forth like that all day long, and it'll be a draw due to repetition. So white will not be able to win if this pawn were already on G4. But since this pawn is still on G3, and the king is situated 2 ranks in front of the pawn, which is one of the 3 critical squares for white, white is guaranteed to win this game. The only problem here is that white does not have the opposition right now, because it's white's turn to move, and 2 kings are directly opposed to each other, and so black has the opposition. So what white does is, white utilizes the tempo of pushing the pawn in order to gain the opposition. Now it's black's turn to act. So now black must move, and white exercises a turning maneuver. This is the classical turning maneuver that white exercises in order to push, in order to gain access to the 6th rank, and eventually to win the game. So yeah, so white has a winning game right now. The only thing that's crucial to remember at this point is that this pawn is a knight pawn, and knight pawns are very tricky. You can't um, you can't win with them unless you pay close attention to what your opponent is doing. Now, of course, if your opponent is cooperating with you, then it's going to be easy. But assuming that black plays a perfect game, black will try to position himself in the corner in h8 and try to force a draw if you push the pawn too early, thereby preventing black from moving to any legal square. So black goes to h8. This is the best move for black. Okay, this is definitely the best move for black at this point. And now white has actually 2 options. The most obvious play is for white to move into f7. But that's actually not the most optimal play. It's not wrong. White will still be able to win. But, and I'll show you how. Here, white moves into f7. I mean, the reason this is the more obvious play is because it controls the queening square. Now you're in control of g8. But the problem is that this is a little too early. The problem is that you are basically forcing black to move from the only 2 legal squares for black is h8 and h7. You're blocking off the entire g file from black, and since black is forced to move between between h8 and h7, the problem is that once the pawn reaches g6, black will be on h8, and black won't have where to move. See, look at this. Black moves to h7, pawn goes to g5, black moves into the corner, and now, now if white pushes the pawn, then it's a draw, because black has nowhere to go. So this is why what you need to remember is, here's the critical thing to remember. The critical thing to remember is that white should not move into the 7th rank until the pawn is already on the 5th rank. That's the key to remember. If you're going to try to occupy a critical square in the 7th rank before you win, then you need to make sure that you don't do that before the pawn is on g5. Otherwise, you're going to have to reposition yourself, and you're just wasting time. So this is why this move to f7 was a little premature. But white can still win, but white just needs to reposition itself. At this point, white cannot, white can push the pawn, but at this point it cannot push the pawn again. Now white needs to reposition itself. White needs to move into g6, and black's only legal move is g8, and now white will move into h6, black is in the corner again, but now white is able to push the pawn. Why? Because white will be able to, because now white is able to push the pawn without check, and black is squeezed out of the corner. So this is okay. The only problem is that, as you can see, this takes more moves. Look at the sideboard here. This takes actually this white only queens on the 10th move. If you go with the more classical, I say the more efficient approach, then white will queen earlier, and also white's queen will be positioned in better to block black's king from escaping, and it'll be a quicker mate. So at this point, the better move is to move into g6. So again, the key to remember here is that white should move into g6 before white moves into f7. First g6, then push the pawn, then move to f7, control the queening square, and then move the pawn into g7 with check, as you'll see in a second here. The king moves to g8. This doesn't matter really at this point, because at this point you're pushing the pawn. Now you're safe to move into f7. Now when you push the pawn, it'll be with check. Black goes into the corner, his best move. Now check again. Now black is squeezed out of the corner, and now not only did you queen a little faster, it's the 8th move instead of the 10th move, as you see on this right panel here, but now as you can see, black's king is really, mate's gonna come really soon. I mean, this is basically mate. This is it. Game over. So it's a really quick mate. Whereas if you take a look at this, the mate's not as fast, and also you just wasted 2 moves. Instead of queening on the 8th move, you're queening on the 10th move. So so yeah, so this is the more efficient play. So once again, at this point, the more efficient thing to do is not g6, but I'm sorry, it's not f7, but g6. Okay, no, sorry, this is wrong. Again, you want to move into g6. Okay, this is the correct move. Why? Because you want to push the pawn first, and then move from the knight file, in the 6th rank of the knight file, into the 7th rank of the bishop file. So that's the procedure if this is a knight pawn. Of course, if it weren't a knight pawn, then the correct play would obviously be to move into f7 right away, because that's the easiest way to simply control the queening square and win outright. But since it's a knight pawn, it's a little more tricky, and so the correct thing is, like I said, to move into g6 first, push the pawn, and then you will be able to, I mean, this is of course assuming that black, is playing optimally. If black doesn't play optimally, there are going to be tons of other ways of winning by simply, just moving into, I mean, this is assuming that black is hiding in the corner, which is the best thing for black to do. If black wanders out in the open, then white can easily move into, for example, h7. Once white controls h7, it's an easy win. So I hope this helps.